Okay, we'll come back to that. All right, so we are kind of dividing and conquering tonight. So my portion of this is basically just to talk about what it was like to be in World War I. It was such a different war from what came before it and what came after it. It's somewhat of a unique experience, really for everybody who fought in it. And then two, I also have my own show and tell. So at the museum, I do a variety of hands-on programs for children. And so this is basically, except for the rifle, because it occurred to me I probably shouldn't walk into a public building with a rifle on election day. This is basically what one American soldier carried in World War I. Starting from the underwear and building all the way up to the gas mask, this is what one man carried. So again, minus the rifle, this is the American experience. This is what these guys lived, fought, and unfortunately way too many cases died in. As you can see in the photo there. So this is supposed to be a loop, but we're just going to go ahead and go through these and talk a little bit about what it was like. So if you don't know, I should not have done that. All right, here we go. So if you know,
Can you dim the lights?
I can't. Somebody can.
Thank you.
Better? All right. So if you know nothing at all about World War I, you know one thing, and that's trenches. So World War I was a war that was fought in trenches. And trenches is kind of a blanket term to cover anything from just the hole in the ground you happen to be in to very well prepared fighting positions that are, as you can see from this photo, I don't have my little pointer, my laser pointer, but you know, I'm going to be fighting this for a little time. There we go. So, I apologize. All right, so your trench systems are usually several lines deep, with the idea being if you're attacked and the enemy manages to get one of your lines, you've got another line behind it. So anybody who survives the first line retreats to the second one, where you've got more troops, and it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. The Germans, whose whole purpose was just to hold the ground they had captured in 1914, they had incredibly complex trench systems that hundreds of thousands and then millions of Allied soldiers, French, British, and American, and other allies, died to take. And in some cases between 1914 and 1918, the front lines didn't move more than about 1.5 miles to 2 miles from where they were in 1914. And so you can imagine over 4 years and hundreds of thousands of people dying, they're just bodies everywhere that have decomposed. If you're lucky, they were buried until shells disinter them, and then they're buried again, and then they're blown into pieces, and then they're blown into smaller pieces. And so everything you did, everywhere you went, I mean, you were surrounded by and covered by death the entire time you were in the trenches. I mean, it was a ghastly, horrible experience. And again, because the Germans were defending, they put a tremendous amount of effort into their trenches, whereas the Allies tended not to, because the entire Allied philosophy was attack, attack, attack. So you don't want a nice, lovely trench because you're not going to be in it very long because you're just going to go attack. And so the Allies didn't put nearly the effort into their trenches. And so this is what you see. You see pretty rudimentary, it's just a hole in the ground. The other thing with trenches is that they were what's called crenellated, right? They don't run in a straight line. Because if a shell lands in the trench, then the shrapnel from that shell will travel a great distance and it'll hit a lot of people. So your trenches run like this, they're zigzags. So if a shell lands in the trench, it'll destroy a small section of trench, but most of the men will be okay. And so what that meant was you had to dig thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of trenches that are at best about 8 to 9 feet deep using a hand shovel. And so it sounds difficult. It is difficult, but if you're being shot at, you can dig awful fast with a very small shovel. And that's what they did. If you took all the trenches that were dug on the Western Front in World War II, stretched them out into a straight line, you could get just short of going all the way around the earth. By 1918, it was possible to walk from the Swiss border to the North Sea without ever putting your head above ground. So that is how complex and how massive these trench systems were. Also, they were just horrible to live in. We've talked about the bodies. There was also mud everywhere, especially in Flanders, in the Low Countries and low parts of France and Belgium. They're always wet, you're always below ground level, and so you're just wet all the time. And you're wearing wool, so now you're wearing wet wool. Wool absorbs water, and so you just get heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier. And then when the weather turns cold, your clothes freeze on you. I mean, just, if you can imagine any terrible experience you can imagine, you had that in the trenches, and that's when they're not shooting at you. And so then add to the fact that World War I also introduces all kinds of new weapons and technologies that will do their absolute best to kill you. This is not a cheery talk, by the way. My portion of this talk is not going to be fun. So again, the whole purpose of being in the trench is that you're supposed to get out of it. You're supposed to get out of the trench. You're supposed to charge across what's called no man's land. It's called no man's land because nobody's out there. If they are out there, they're probably dead. And you are supposed to get over your barbed wire, go across anything from the front line might be the width of this room. It might be 3/4 of a mile. It just depends on where you happen to be in the trench system. And go across that no man's land and then storm an enemy trench. And to do that, you had to survive artillery that's coming down on you. You had to survive rifle fire. You had to survive machine gun fire. You had to avoid mud like this. This is Passchendaele in 1917, which was famous for its mud. And again, you had to get across all of this just to try to kill somebody before they killed you. And you can imagine how difficult that would be. In 1916, on July 1st, 1916, that was the first day of the Battle of the Somme. You've probably heard of this one. It's a very famous battle. Like every battle in World War I, this was the battle that was supposed to break open the German line. The British would storm through, the war would be over in 2 days, 10 days. One of the things they did to increase enlistment in the British Army in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme was they created what were called PALS battalions. And what that meant was, let's say we're all buddies, we all know each other. We could all enlist and we could all serve together. And so what that meant was entire battalions would be made up of residents from 1 or 2 towns. They would all be neighbors, they would all know each other. And it worked. They got hundreds of thousands of people to join the British Army. On the first day of the Somme, 19,000 were killed and 42,000 were wounded. And on the second day of the Somme, the British attacked again. And they attacked again on the third day, and again, and again, and again, and again. And they attacked essentially every day for 6 months. And when they finally called it off, everybody involved had suffered about 1 million casualties total. And so what that meant for the PALS battalions was that in England, on July 2nd, there were towns all across England where basically the entire military-age population, male population, was gone. They're all gone. They're dead, they're wounded, but they will never be there again, or if they are, they will be, in many cases, maimed for life. Again, it's unbelievably horrible. One of the things that made it so bad was artillery. In World War I and World War II, both the chief killer was not a bullet, it was artillery. It was shrapnel. That's especially true in World War I because if you weren't attacking, you're down inside your trench, where as long as you keep your head down, you're not going to get shot. Well, the bullets are going above the trench. But again, because shells do this, they will fall into trenches and they will kill men even though they're safe from bullets. So in World War I, about 60% of all casualties were by artillery fire. Metallurgy at that time was not quite what it was by World War II, and certainly not in today's standards. And so what that meant was that when shells exploded, they didn't explode into tiny little slivers. They exploded into, in some cases, fist-sized chunks of metal that would hit you, and they would do unbelievably horrific things to a human body. And the worst ones were the ones that survived that, because the after effects would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Of course, you had machine guns. Most machine guns that were used in World War I were water-cooled. That's the big jacket at the front of the gun. And what that meant was you could fire longer because the barrel wouldn't overheat because it was cooled by water. And so you could just spray bullets. Bullets upon bullets upon bullets. As long as you had ammo, you basically never had to stop shooting. And so again, that's how you end up with 60,000 casualties on the first day of the Somme. You also had airplanes. So we're seeing this right now in Ukraine and Russia where you can't hide anymore, right? Because when you have drones that will fly right down into your bunker, well, obviously they weren't that complicated in World War I. Remember, we had only started flying 11 years before World War I began. But still, you couldn't hide anymore, right? Even though you think you might be safe in your trench, an airplane could fly over the trench and drop hand grenades, drop bombs, drop rocks, whatever they happen to have, they would throw that at you just to try to hurt one more guy. World War I also introduced tanks. This is the first time you see tanks in combat. They were invented by the British. They first started using them late in 1916. They didn't work particularly well. They weren't very powerful. They weren't very successful. But again, jump ahead to World War II, and this is where all of these things are taking place. This is where all of this is starting. It's the first industrialized war. The one big thing that I'm happy to say did not come out of World War I and go much farther was, of course, poison gas. And I would say that is the other enduring image of World War I. You know trenches and you know poison gas. So all kinds of different gas were used during the war. They started with chlorine, which could kill you, but chances are you would survive. Then they went to a gas called phosgene, which would kill you very quickly. The problem with phosgene was that it was colorless and it was odorless, and so you didn't know it was there until somebody died. And then you put a gas mask on. And then they went to mustard gas, and mustard gas was probably the worst of all of them because it could kill you, but it was also a blistering agent. So if it got onto your skin, it would cause horrible lesions to grow on your skin, and if you breathed it in, you'd get those horrible lesions in your throat, in your mouth, in your lungs, and it took a very, very long time to die, and it hurt the whole time. So again, the one good thing I would argue came out of World War I is that everybody who was in charge of World War II, including Hitler, had been gassed in World War I, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And so the people who were in charge of World War II more or less drew the line at using poison gas in World War II because they saw the effects of gas in World War I. So,
napalm was more effective.
Well, you had napalm. So, yeah, not saying it got better, it just got different. All right, so then you have this. This is one of the most famous photos of World War I. It shows a French soldier during the Battle of Verdun being killed while attacking the German lines. Except it doesn't. This is actually a still from a propaganda movie that was shot after World War I. But still, it is very evocative of what it looked like to fight and die in World War I. This is another very famous photo. This is a casualty being carried out of the trenches. Several years ago now, in 2018, they had We Shall Not Grow Old, right? Did anybody see that? That was the film that was modernized, basically run through computers to make it look like it was shot yesterday. If you have not seen it, I highly encourage you to check it out because it brings World War I to life in a way that those of us who didn't know anybody personally who fought in it, we will never understand what it was like because we weren't there. But that movie, We Shall Not Grow Old, They Shall Not Grow Old, is as close as you can get today. So just to bring us back full circle, I mean, if you fought and lived and died in World War I, this is what you saw. You saw this on industrial scale. You saw this everywhere you went, everywhere you looked. This was what you saw. And what to me is truly amazing about World War I is that how many people, how many men lived and fought in the trenches and saw this on a daily basis and then came home and said these were the best years of their lives. Something to keep in mind, let's say you joined a PALS battalion, and you joined a PALS battalion and you were put in a quiet sector where you're not on the Somme and you're not charging across no man's land. Basically what you're doing is you're camping with your friends, right? You're on an extended camping holiday with all the guys from your hometown, and if it was quiet, it was great until it wasn't. But so the men who survived, many of them chose to remember the good times. Many of them probably blacked out the bad times or blocked out the bad times, and that's how they got through, and that's how they came home and built as successful a life as they could. The other thing they did was, and what is amazing to me, is how much of a sense of humor they managed to keep. And I'm going to finish my part of this with, it's not really a joke, it's just kind of like a, what do they call it, like a logical syllogism, I guess, that went around the trenches in World War I. And it's why you don't have to worry. And it's kind of long, so bear with me. What they used to say was, if you're in the Army, you're either in the trenches or you're not. If you're not, you have nothing to worry about. If you're in the trenches, you're either in the front line or you're not. If you're not, you have nothing to worry about. If you're in the front line, you're either attacking or you're not. If you're not, you have nothing to worry about. If you are attacking, you're either wounded or you're not. If you're not, you have nothing to worry about. If you are wounded, it's either serious or it's not. If it's not, you have nothing to worry about. If it is serious, you either die or you don't. If you don't, you have nothing to worry about. If you do die, you can't worry, so there's nothing to worry about. And that's the kind of humor that got these guys through this unbelievable hell that never happened before and thankfully has never happened again. Because World War I, as terrible as it was an entirely different beast than World War I. Because of all these new technologies that nobody really knew how to use, and this was just one 4-year-long experiment in hell, basically. And so again, the stuff that you see on the table there is a mix of original and reproduction items, because we do let children handle this stuff at work. The stuff that I'm worried about getting destroyed is reproduction, and the rest of it, as much as possible, is original. But what you see there is the uniform. You see the boots, the puttees, which is what they used to wrap around their shins, the helmet, all their web gear, and then down at the end you see 2 gas masks, because they usually carry 2, just in case it was a prolonged attack, because your filters will get saturated. And so you have to try to take one mask off and put the new one on without breathing or without getting any of the gas caught in your new mask before you put it on. So there's a technique to it. I don't know how to do it. I would have died immediately. But the other thing that I put out, which is always interesting to me, is I put out a day's worth of food. Because to me, what is interesting is what kept these guys fed. What kept them with the calories they needed to do what they did. And so 1 day's worth of food for a World War I soldier, an American soldier, came down to basically 3 things. You had either corned beef, or you had bacon, whichever one you happen to get, but you got 2 cans of that. You had 2 packages of crackers, and you had coffee and salt. And that's it. So you lived on basically corned beef, crackers, and salt, and coffee. Day after day after day after day. Now what they also did, you'll notice, everything was carried in metal tins, because the idea this is supposed to protect it from gas, right? Because if you get gas into your food and you eat that food, then you're just another casualty. So how am I doing on time? 7:20? Not too bad. Is that enough time for you, Mary?
A lot of soldiers stole from the dead from the German and vice versa. So a different change of diet, probably.
Sure, probably happen. So I've got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions about anything? This is just the most bare bones what it was like from a guy who wasn't there. So I can't tell you what it was like. I can tell you I didn't want to be there, but yeah.
The one photo of the soldiers in the trenches, I looked at the ground and it was like wood slats.
Yeah, those were called duck boards. And the idea with that is it was just to give you a hard surface and to get you out of the mud. And usually you had a drain running underneath. So if you had the opportunity, then you made a very complicated trench system with dugouts, deep holes in the ground, deeper than the trench, that you could survive bombardments. But yeah, you would put down, basically you'd put those down. You had those down in the bottom of your trench to give you a surface to walk on. You also have what was called you had a little, I don't know, bump that you would stand on that was the firing line. So most of the time, you're about 2 feet below the level of the trench. But if you had to fight, you would step up onto the firing line so that you're just about this much of you is above ground, because you don't want any more of that above ground if necessary. Just enough that you could operate a rifle or a machine gun or whatever. Yeah.
What was the name of that movie?
They Shall Not Grow Old. It was actually done by the guy who created the Lord of the Rings movies. So the computers that he used to make all of the CGI for Lord of the Rings, he used those computers to take footage from World War I and upscale it so that it looks like it was shot on a modern camera. Peter Jackson, yeah, thank you. And the most amazing part of it to me was that he then, when you look at these guys who from 100 years later, now the quality of the footage is now so good that you can see their mouths move, he then gave that footage to deaf people who can read lips. And he had them transcribe what these people are saying. And so now, for the first time since 1914, you're watching this footage from World War I, and then they went in and dubbed people saying what these guys were saying in 1918. And it's amazing, because they're just talking about, you bummed a cigarette from me yesterday, you owe me a cigarette. I mean, none of this is earth-shattering stuff, but to hear their voices from 100 years ago, it's really powerful, really amazing. Yeah.
What do they do about personal hygiene, like latrines and toilets and things?
Yeah, so they dug latrines, and you did your business then just like you do your business now. The one thing was you were supposed to be clean shaven because you had to get a tight seal with your mask. But otherwise, I mean, yeah, they had sinks that you would, as much as you could, you'd go and use that. And if you couldn't use that, then you'd use something else. So when you gotta go, you gotta go. So, yes?
The movie showed that one scene with the 3 poles making the latrine.
Yeah.
And a whole line of bare butts sitting there.
Sure. There's no privacy in the army. There's no privacy in the army now. There was no privacy in the Roman army. I mean, that's life.
That's war.
What's the status of those trenches now? Are any of them left? Or they're so...
There are a very small number of trenches. I mean, they're restored. So, you know, they have duck boards, they have dugouts that you can go and see that they are museum pieces now. You can still see where trenches, it's like going to Gettysburg and going to Culp's Hill, and you can see, you know, this much of the fighting positions that they prepared. So by and large, the trenches are mostly, I mean, they'll never be gone, but they're by and large, they're not the 8-foot deep holes in the ground that they used to be. They're filled because they're farmers' fields. The farmers want their fields back. And so, you know, for the most part, they've been filled in, but the shell holes are there. The craters from the giant mines they set off in the Somme are still there, and they always will be. So my grandmother was Belgian, and so I've always been interested in Belgian history. The only, how do I say this, make sure I get this right. The only unit of the Belgian army that is permanently on active duty is their bomb disposal team. Because there is so much unexploded ordnance from, I mean, Belgium is rightfully known as the battleground of Europe. So pick a war. Napoleon, World War I, World War II, you name a war, and there is unexploded ordnance in the ground in Belgium from one of those wars. And so these guys' job is just to go out and find that ordnance and pick it up and destroy it so that it doesn't destroy people. So there's sections of Verdun that the best estimate is they will not be occupiable by humans for 700 years because of the amount of poison gas and remnants of chemicals from explosives and bodies and everything you can imagine that's in that ground. I mean, it was bad. There is no better way to say it. Yes?
I was going to ask you, in the trenches too, I heard there was a lot of rats.
Oh, sure.
You had to fight them too.
Yeah, yeah, rats, I mean, yeah. Yep. I don't have much to add to that. I mean, yeah, so they used, I mean, again, this is horrific, but it would look like dead bodies were dancing on the ground because they're being eaten by rats. And you're watching this happen every day. Every day you're there. So I'll take 2 more because I know Mary's got to go too. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, just a quick follow-up to the gentleman's question about the trenches.
Yeah.
I'm giving a talk in January on relics and trench art.
Oh, cool.
And I go over to Flanders 2 to 3 times a year.
Wow.
And the trenches are all over.
Sure.
Most of them are on private land, and some of them have been reconstructed with the duck boards and the aluminum walls, so to speak. But you mentioned the iron harvest. There's so much unexploded ordnance. You drive down the road, a farmer's road, and you will see piles of grenades and shells and so forth. Presumably live, you don't go and test it.
Yeah.
But even in Verdun, Vimy Ridge, and the Somme, it's all blocked off with wire, barbed wire, because of the amount of live unexploded ordnance.
Yeah.
The only thing that are living in there are sheep.
So if, in Verdun, which we didn't talk about Verdun, but Verdun was another unbelievably horrible battle. It was the longest battle of the war. It lasted about 10 months. And this was one of the rare occasions where it was the Germans attacking instead of the Allies, which didn't change anything. It just, they were dying going this way instead of going that way now. But by the end of it, 10 months, that's another 1 million casualties. And if you go to Verdun today, in fact, the last, I think it's the next slide, 2 slides, You probably noticed that massive cemetery, that's Verdun. At the Verdun Cemetery, they have an ossuary, which is basically a big room where they put bones. If they don't know who they are, they put them in the ossuary. And the ossuary is, I've read an estimate, you might know this better than I do, but the estimate I think is fragments of 300,000 people.
And they could be any nationality.
Yeah, it's anybody. If they find a skull, it goes in there. If they find a shin bone, it goes in there. If they find something the size of my thumb, it goes in there. So how many people it is, we will never know. Personally, I don't think we should know. I don't think we need to know, because what makes it powerful is you look at that thing and just remember that we did that to ourselves, right? That's 300,000 maybe people that we collectively, we did that to each other. And it's a very, very powerful reminder of how unbelievably stupid all of this is. And there's no reason for it. So I'm going to stop because Mary needs to take her turn. Yeah, there you go. So that is, that's one of the cemeteries at Verdun. How many people are buried like this? I truly don't know, but it's tens of thousands. And then again, you have the ossuary, which is another very, very large number. So.
Thank you. While Mary's getting organized, I just wanted to recognize Mr. Kaparoff up there where I had my senior moment. He's our speaker in January. And you've been, what, 20 times to Europe?
At least 20 times.
At least 20, to visit these battlefields, collect relics, and he'll be here in January. And that will be our 4th session in a year on World War I. And the reason we've spent that many sessions, I'm holding these white sheets up, is because over the last couple of years, a lot of people said, we want stuff on World War I. So we've had 4 sessions this year up. So thank you.
All right. So, it's now a bad time to tell you that World War I makes me queasy. Eric did a really good job of setting up what I am going to talk about, despite not knowing what I was going to talk about, because I think a lot of what he had to tell you conveyed sort of the terror of being a part of World War I and the really scary things that were happening in the trenches, which are what made me queasy, and you know, sort of setting up the trauma that a lot of the soldiers who were participating in the war were going to suffer. One of the things that's true about World War I is that we would not have modern art as we know it if World War I hadn't happened. And so my background, my day job is at the museum where I try to facilitate ways for students to come and learn things about Cleveland history or to play with Eric's kids. But my training is in art history, specifically French art history. And so what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about tonight is how artists responded to World War I, and in some cases that might be as much as 10 years later, because they were still processing what they had seen and finding ways to communicate how sort of mentally what had happened to them. And they're doing this in a way that brings in art from the even further back. And again, we wouldn't have modern art as we know it without World War I, and it sort of forges the way into the future. So the place that I want to start is with this painting, which is John Singer Sargent's Gassed. It was finished in March 1919, and it now hangs in the Imperial War Museum in London. It was actually a commission by the British Ministry of Information. They were already prepping in the summer of 1818 to have a sort of hall of remembrance built for World War I, right? And that's before the war is over, but they're already sort of planning the memorialization of the war. And so they hire John Singer Sargent to go out to the battlefields and find a topic. They tell him they want something epic. They want something that tells the story of this intense war, the immense losses that the British have suffered. And I don't know if you have heard the name John Singer Sargent before, but he is not a guy who does this usually, he is a guy who does this. These are three of his most famous paintings. The one on the left is Madame X, who's very famous for being like a Parisian socialite. The one in the middle is the one that's actually in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her name is Lisa Colt Curtis. And one of the things he is very good at is this sort of bravura style of brushwork where you can see the brush strokes and they're very feathery and dramatic. And then the one here on the right it's called El Jaleo, and it's a Spanish dancer. It's in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And so, he's interested in music, he's interested in the arts, there are a lot of theories about what Sargent was like as a person. And in 1918, when he is commissioned to paint this, he is also 62. So he goes out to the battlefields looking for his epic topic. And, part of what he interprets epic to mean is a scene where there's going to be lots of people. Right? And in World War I, as Eric kind of illustrated, you have miles of trench line where people are sort of lined up. There's no open battlefields, right? Like, this is not the Franco-Prussian War. We are not charging across the battlefields. We are not firing our cannons so much in the same, dramatic way. It's sort of a sneaky, hidden, stealthy kind of war. So there's not going to be a battle where he's going to be able to get a scene of a bunch of people fighting like hand-to-hand combat. And he's not going to be able to see it because he is a 62-year-old man who is trying not to die. Didn't have a lot of survival skills of that nature. He happens upon a scene in August 1918 while he's traveling of a group of men who, and he's in France, he happens upon the scene of a group of men who had been mustard gassed, who were being led across one of those duck boards. You can kind of see the wood on the ground under their feet, across one of those duck boards into the tent, the dressing tent, which is what those ropes are on the right side of the screen. Where they're going to be treated for the mustard gas. One of the things that happens when you get mustard gas is that if it gets in your eyes, that's a big problem, right? Because of all the terrible things Eric said could happen, if it gets in your eyes, right, you can't see, your eyes are watering, it's really awful. And so he was really moved by the sight of these men who were holding on to each other. There's a man in the front who's an orderly who's leading them into the tent. There's another group of guys in the back who've already been treated. There's, if you look here in the middle by the back end of that guy's rifle, there is a man playing soccer in the background, right? And this horrible thing has just happened to all these men in the front, but there's still a soccer game being played in the background. And so for him, this was epic. It was a way for him to show a mass amount of people, and to do so with the kind of finely honed painterly skill that he would have used to depict those portrait subjects. And if you're asking yourself, wow, why are the colors so different in these two different images? It's because one of them is from before they cleaned it, and then they went back and cleaned it. And this is probably much more like, the one in the front is probably much more like what Sargent would have wanted it to look like. And Sargent probably also had a particular motivation for wanting to be a part of a project that memorialized World War I. He was American by birth, but his family were the sort of cosmopolitan world traveler types. That spent time in Italy and spent time in Paris and spent time in London, and he continued that as an adult. And he had a niece whose name was Rosemarie Ormond, who had been killed in the bombing of the Church of Saint-Gervais in Paris on Good Friday I believe earlier that year in 1918. She was 24, and she had been working as a nurse treating blinded soldiers like these, after her husband, whose name was Robert, had died earlier fighting in the war. So that was a particularly poignant topic for Sargent. And Sargent is unique, I think, in the sense that he's one of the few depictions of a battlefield scene that is really just kind of a battlefield scene. It shows men on the battlefield kind of being treated. It's soldiers as they are, and it's happening relatively contemporaneously with the war. It's much more common to see artists who had one style before the war and a totally different style after the war. The two that you see on the screen right now, the one on the left is Pablo Picasso, who I'm sure you've all heard of. And he did not fight in the war, but I'll tell you why I'm talking about him. And the one on the right, his name is Fernand Léger, and he is a French painter. Both of these are examples of Cubism, which was sort of the popular style at the beginning of the 20th century. The idea is that there are solid forms in there. And the one on the left, there's a woman and a guitar and some other stuff. The one on, just bear with me, I promise this is not the point. The one on the right is called Nude Model in the Studio.
Oh.
And I'll let you think about that for a minute. Right, but everything is sort of split up and rearranged, and it's supposed to sort of challenge your perception of the objects themselves. Like I said, Picasso didn't fight in the war. Most of the Spaniards sort of got a free pass if we're talking about artists. But Léger did. Léger was, he was mobilized in August 1914. He spent 2 years at the front in Argonne. He sketched military themes for much of the time that he was there. In September 1916, he almost died after a mustard gas attack at Verdun. And then after that tremendously changed how he viewed both sort of his sight and his art. Because he talks about, he says, "I was stunned by the sight of the breach of a 75 millimeter in the sunlight. It was the magic of light on the white metal. That's all it took for me to forget the abstract art of 1912 to 1913. The crudeness, variety, humor, and downright perfection of certain men around me, their precise sense of utilitarian reality, and its application in the midst of the life and death drama we're in, it made me want to paint and slang with all its color and mobility." And so he starts to experiment. And after the war, you see those two men shift to something completely different. And this is part of a period that's known as the return to order. Picasso, his version of the return to order, which is part of, he feels acutely this sort of fear of the other that's happening in France. They're sort of angry at Germany, right, for everything that has happened to France. Somehow Cubism gets bound up as like a foreign style, and Picasso feels like he has to reject Cubism in order to sort of assimilate with his French friends. And so what he does is he starts painting these sort of classical looking forms. And right, like these women are pretty solid looking women. They are wearing clothes that make them look like they could be on the Parthenon or something like that. But this is also this return to order, this idea that if you are sort of reassembling all of those forms that you split apart, in Cubism, you are contributing to the society as a whole. You're contributing to making society whole. For Léger, he's still playing around with color, he's still playing around with a little bit with abstract art. But what he has here is a picture of a mother and a child. The child's head is by the red vertical there. And this mother and child theme is very sort of a comment on that return to order too, because that France has to put itself back together. Someone has to lead France into the future, has to take care of France and turn it into the glorious state that it once was. And France is also still reeling from that Franco-Prussian War and being embarrassed. And so they're trying to realize the restoration of society by being conservative in their artwork. And so that's sort of the first way these artists can go. They can be conservative, they can step back, they can abandon their abstract styles, and they can try to make their art nationalist, give it this sort of symbolic theme, and give it a less complicated view of the future. Other artists, for example, Otto Dix, who was a German painter, did not handle it so well. Otto Dix volunteered for the German army. I think when he went into the German army, he had some, sort of optimistic ideas of what warfare would be like, that he would be a hero. He was assigned to a field artillery regiment in Dresden, and became a non-commissioned officer on a machine gun unit, took part in the Battle of the Somme. In 1917, he was transferred to the Eastern Front and fought there until February 1914 when he was stationed in Flanders. So he saw sort of a little bit of everything, the worst of the war, and he stayed in the army for quite a while, and he wasn't injured in the same way that Leger was. He wasn't exposed to mustard gas in the same way that Leger was, but he was profoundly affected. He always talked about how he had recurring nightmares of crawling through houses, of destroyed houses, and couldn't let it go for a really, really, really long time. And so this particular image, so this is that center part there with the square part and the bottom part is about 100 inches tall. And so that's, that's very tall. This is a very big painting. On the left side, it represents daybreak. There is a way in which this is a pretty literal representation of what happens in a soldier's day. So the left panel shows troops setting off at daybreak. The central panel shows the battlefield as a place of death. The right panel shows soldiers returning from the battle, which Dix conceives as hell. The battle is hell, and they're coming out of hell. And in the bottom part, which is called the predella, you can see the dead soldiers resting there. And Dix's approach isn't the approach that they're going to whitewash it. It isn't something else. It is realism. He's going to give you the grittiest, goriest, most upsetting version of war in his paintings on a massive scale because that's what happened to him. And he wants to drag you through it. And he gets that idea from maybe an unlikely place, or maybe an obvious place, depending on your line of thinking. This is a famous altarpiece in Germany from the early 16th century. It's called the Isenheim altarpiece. It was made by an artist whose name is Matthias Grunewald, and it is pretty standard Christian imagery in some ways, right? It shows the crucifixion of Christ. But it was made for a hospital that specifically treated skin diseases. And so Grunewald made some of the details and the sort of bodily harm aspects of the crucifixion as gory and terrifying as he could. And when Dix went to make his war, he stole Grunewald's format, right? And this is an altarpiece that would be put in the front of a chapel or a church. So it would be the sort of thing that you would stare at while you were praying and contemplate and think about whatever scene is on the altarpiece. Dix adds those elements to his altarpiece, but in a way that is totally secular, because he understands that sort of beat for the German psyche, being one that has this kind of religion that is sort of intense and focused on suffering, and he thinks that is part of the way that he can get his message across. If you've heard of Otto Dix, it's probably not because of this, it's probably because of these. His way of finally getting rid of the war in his head, as much as he could, was that he, after he made that painting, he released a set of 50 etchings and other kinds of prints that sort of tell the whole story of being a German soldier in the war. And so I have picked 3 of them here. This one is the city of Lens being bombed. And you can see the plane up there, which is kind of a neat detail for a World War I scene, and all of the people who are so sort of, they just sort of fall apart in their fear. They don't even look like people anymore, they look like skeletons. You have shock troops advancing under gas, and it's kind of the same deal. When they have the gas masks on, they don't look like people anymore. They look like bugs or evil doers, or trying not to make a Star Wars reference because that's anachronistic. Halloween characters, yeah. And then you have that one up there. That reminds me a lot of Timothy O'Sullivan's photograph of Gettysburg in the Civil War. But displaying the actual carnage of the war on the field, and this is the tip of the iceberg. There are 50 of these. And in that way, Autodix kind of purges it from his system, but he's part of a style that is called Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity. This idea that realism, that painting or drawing things exactly as they are, can be harsh enough and intense enough to sort of purge or make it unforgettable for you, the viewer. So we've had straightforward depictions, we've had conservatism, we've had Autodix dragging you through his pain, and now we have something that's a little bit different, because it comes from sort of a different place. I'm sure that you've heard of surrealism before as an art style. Some of you have probably heard of Salvador Dali, who was too young to fight in World War I and also a Spaniard, so he, again, sort of ends up with a free pass. But a lot of people think that surrealism, which is an art style that's based in psychological explorations, the potential of the human mind, and the crazy things that your brain will do under pressure, a lot of people think that it came out of the way that the body was injured in World War I. And there's an art historian named Amy Lyford who calls this an aesthetics of dismemberment, which she believes comes out of the fact that the 2 men who were responsible for writing the Surrealist Manifesto that created the movement served as psychiatry students at the Val de Grace Military Hospital in France. And at Val de Grace, not only were they learning Freud and learning all of the sort of in vogue psychiatry methods at the time, but Val de Grace also was making these wax models of the men who were coming back from the war to teach medical students what they were doing to try to treat them. And so people who had been in World War I would come through Val de Grace. They would potentially have their face cast. They would talk to the psychiatrists, who were quickly becoming apprised of, what we now understand as something more like PTSD, and they would have called shell shock, or male hysteria is a term that you see in some of the literature. And they're starting to wonder, how far can the brain be pushed? And what happens if you sort of unchain your brain from everything that has previously tied you to reality and the world that you live in? And so one of those poets turned psychiatrist turned poet again, his name was André Breton, and he wrote the Manifesto of Surrealism, which talks about psychic automatism, and how one proposes to express verbally by means of the written word or any other manner the actual functioning of thought, dictated by the thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. So basically, if you let your brain go and let it take you where it takes you, what happens? And if you ask that of people who have been through a trench war, you get some pretty scary stuff. One of the things that, for example, you might get is something like this painting by Max Ernst. It's called Celeb, and it's from 1921. Max Ernst was another person who had joined the German army, and he wrote that on the 1st of August 1914, Max Ernst died. He was resurrected on the 11th November 1918 as a young man who aspired to find the myths of his time. So that boy he was before the war is over. 4 years the war didn't happen. On Veterans Day, on November 11th, Armistice Day, Max Ernst emerges as this new man, this new artist, this surrealist painter. And so what he's doing here is sort of drawing in forms from all sorts of references, but also potentially that sort of trauma of the war, because you can see in the background there's like a plume of smoke. There's this thing over here that kind of looks like a plane. In putting those things around this big monstrous metal body, which depending on how you look at it, might seem, it looks like an old-fashioned vacuum cleaner to me. But it could be a vacuum cleaner, it could be a tank, it could be all sorts of things. And it's your job to sort of figure out how this works in the mind of Max Ernst. This post-World War I surrealism is tricky because it's dark. René Magritte, who you might have heard of, he's the one who did the top hat with the apple face. He was Belgian, and he served in Belgium in World War I, and we know that Belgium saw a lot of the worst of it. And you don't get somebody like Salvador Dali with his meditations on time without the scarier stuff in between. And so, I'll leave you with this list. This is some recommended reading for you if you want to know more. The first one is an exhibition catalog from a few years ago, World War I in American Art. So if you really, really, really wanted to hear about the American stuff, find that book. The second one is about Dada, which is a style I didn't have time to talk about, but sort of covers a lot of European art. The next two are the medical stuff. So if you're really interested in the medical stuff and Val de Grace and plastic surgery and those mutilés de guerre, as they called them in Paris, these are the two books for you, The Facemaker and Surrealist Masculinities. And then when I was looking stuff up, I found that there's a brand new book coming out about Otto Dix that focuses specifically on World War I. And I'm not going to say that's going to be fun, because that might be not the right word, but I'm sure it will be very interesting. And so I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to let Eric take more questions. Yeah.
For you, or Eric, did you see the film 1917?
Yes, it made me queasy. I'm not kidding. I don't know. I can't handle trench warfare. I can like rank all the World War I movies I've seen.
Eric, where did Eric? Did you see it?
I did. Yeah, I saw it. I thought artistically it was amazing.
Yeah.
I had a lot of problems with the actual content, but that's just me nitpicking. It was good. It's a movie.
The point of view stuff, right? Like the what you can see, like how it puts you in the head of the soldiers. I think that's its value, and maybe gets you a little bit closer to understanding how you can get some of this stuff after the war. Because it's, again, I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but my stomach hurt afterwards.
I got an off the wall one for anybody. Has anybody here seen The Black Cat? It's a horror movie from like 1933 with Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and other folks set in an abandoned World War I fort.
It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure I've seen it.
You remember it?
Yeah.
You want to talk a minute about it?
I don't think I remember it that well. I would have said it was a Vincent Price movie.
That was the Doughboys.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to the St. Nicholas Church in Pittsburgh? They have a bunch of murals on the wall that are kind of in the style of Otto Dix, and I think it was painted by a Croatian artist in the interwar period. That reminds me of Otto Dix. Like there's a crucifixion scene with a soldier wearing World War I attire spearing the side of Jesus. So that brought my mind around to that.
I have not been there.
So it's a museum now, I believe. They managed to save it from a highway going through.
Okay.
So yeah, I believe they were painted like in the interwar period, like in the 1920s.
That makes sense. There's a lot of the German painters and a lot of Eastern European painters were sort of going back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of them would work in Prague, or some of them would go further out to Zagreb or other places in like Croatia, and they knew each other and they'd figure out how to work together. But I'll look that up.
I realize that you have an area of specialty that has to do with an era surrounding the First World War. I was wondering if you ever had a chance to compare the combat paintings out of World War II to those out of World War I.
Sort of. Because between the wars, right, you get a little more action from something like the Futurists, right? And the Futurists are mostly Italian. Gino Severini is my favorite, and he paints a lot of like armored tanks, and their thing is that war is good. War drives technology, war drives the world's economy, war is power, and we like power. Some of them are pretty aligned with Mussolini, but there are ways in which some futurist paintings look a lot like Cubism, and I talked about Picasso sort of backing away from Cubism because he thought, I can't, Leger backs away because he can't handle this abstraction anymore. He has to paint reality sort of as he conceives it. But for the futurists, it's the fragmentation that gives them the quickness and the speed and the intensity that they need, and so they love it. So in that way, they're sort of using the same, they're diverging on techniques that they're all capable of doing and what they give them. But World War II happens the same way, and you don't get Jackson Pollock without World War II, because all of the people that I talked about leave Europe and come to New York, and Max Ernst comes to New York and teaches surrealism to a whole new generation of American painters, and then you get abstract expressionism. So it's all part of the same ecosystem.
Thank you.
Sure.
Where does the trench art fit into all this, like the soldiers who took the shell casings and either etched pictures on them or things like that, or took the detritus of war and made art out of it?
I think that art history as a field is kind of snobby, which is why I work in a history museum. Those things are viewed as kind of a folk art situation where regular people who don't have training are making art and expressing themselves, and often making these really lovely, creative, or not lovely, but poignant images or objects. But then the question becomes, like, what is their place in relation to this kind of stuff? And most art historians will not get too enthused about that kind of stuff because it is completely separate from like formal art training, but that doesn't mean that it's not fascinating, right? I mean, you know that, and you know that, and you're all about to know that in January.
Yeah, my wife and I in September were in Slovenia, which was Osha River Valley. And as opposed to the trench warfare, this was more mass troops going up River Valley. And they impressed upon us that many more people died in the eastern front and in that area than in the west. And we just don't know much about
Well, and
what happened over there.
that's true about World War II too, if we're gonna talk about
Absolutely.
similarities, right? As many
Yeah.
more people died on the eastern front. But, right, they have different ways of processing things. Western Europe is like a hyper-visual, really, really modern, forward-thinking kind of society, and I think Eastern Europe is slightly less hyper-visual in that way.
A lot of icons, a lot of still religious comparison.
Right, and Dix is perverting religion kind of for what he's trying to do, but most of these guys are not doing religious art. They're not talking about icons. They're not talking about thinking a god is going to rescue them on the battlefield. And you're probably right that the Eastern stuff is much different.
Did Otto Dix, did he have like a rich benefactor that was giving him money to make these paintings? Was he putting on any art galleries, or was he kind of just living a life of poverty after?
There's a certain point in art history where everybody sort of stops taking money from rich people and starts making their political stuff. And so Otto Dix is much more like a person who is living in poverty and making the paintings and stuff that he wants to make. But he has a certain degree of success that other painters don't necessarily. Like, that's part of the reason he gets to make a 50 print portfolio, which is not cheap, is that people like his art and they want his art. And he's actually, again, talking about connections to World War II, he's one of the painters and artists who's deemed a degenerate artist by the Nazis. And so his art is sometimes destroyed, is sometimes hidden and not found for a long time. And somehow he survives all of that and stays in Germany and lives a relatively long life. But he's out there on his own making that stuff because he wants to give, and he can't not make that statement.
I don't know if it's a comment, but can you say something about Walt Disney with his experiences being over in Europe just after the war, because he was late getting there, and he was still drawing on the ambulance trucks, and he was always hanging out with Ray Kroc and Ernest Hemingway. There's a famous photograph, the three of them, but his artwork changes a little bit. I mean, he starts off trucks with, well, now it's now Mickey Mouse and earlier versions. But then by the time he's getting to World War II, he's designing more fun stuff. I don't know if he's trying to leave what he saw in Europe, because he was right there on the battlefield.
Well, and he gets into the propaganda stuff too, doesn't he? They're Disney war propaganda films. You probably just said more about Walt Disney and World War I than I know, to be very honest. But that's the tricky part about talking about the American artists, right? Is we know Hemingway, we know the Lost Generation, we know that they go to Paris after and they live it up with all the French people who just had like the trauma of their life. They change and they come back to the US and they bring it back with them. But for them, it's not always that direct route from the war as it is for someone like Dix or someone like Ernst. So thank you for saying that.